Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about what I've read in the last few weeks. I have decided to stop doing monthly wrap-ups. I just find them a bit restrictive, and I much prefer watching people who just do like recent reads videos and don't align them to a certain time period. So that is what I'm going to be doing going forwards. So I have quite a few books to talk to you about. Most of these are new releases. I am on a massive new release train this year, so by the end of the year I think I will have read a considerable amount of 2023 releases, which is quite exciting. So I've had a real mixed bag with the books I've read so far this month, actually. But even though some of them I haven't ended up loving, they gave me quite a lot to think about, and like at points they were still quite an enjoyable experience whilst reading. I don't know if that really makes any sense. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Guest by Emma Cline. I think this was one of the buzzier releases of this year because quite a few years ago she released the debut novel The Girls, which was a massive release at the time. I'm just going to sort of talk about that for a moment. I read that when it came out, and I remember finding it really compulsive and very readable. I always like coming of age narratives, and if you don't know, although I'm pretty sure you do, it is about a young girl who one summer gets involved with the Manson family and doesn't really realise who they are, and sort of gets embroiled with that. And then there is an element of the novel which is her as a much older woman looking back on that summer. I found that novel, like I said, really readable. I think thematically it was really interesting, but I think, as a lot of people felt, the contemporary narrative of the older woman looking back was just like not very well done at all. And when I read that novel, I didn't really think much, and that makes it sound like I'm criticising Emma Cline, but what I mean is I didn't think much of the writing, as in the writing wasn't what made that book interesting. That book was interesting because of the plot and because of, I guess, the tone of it. I didn't read it and think, God, this is a really interesting writer on a sentence by sentence level. And actually I do think that about Emma Cline now with The Guest. I know she had a short story collection out in between, which I did try to read, but I DNF'd because I just found it quite depressing. Again, interesting to me because this is a really depressing book, The Guest, and I didn't DNF it. I think in part that could be because I read it over just like one evening. I read it across the course of I think 4 or 5 hours. And I think because of that I didn't spend a prolonged period of time with this quite depressing, aimless character. Something I always struggle with in novels is reading from the perspective of somebody who's quite aimless, who seems to make quite poor choices and who is clearly very depressed. I just find that really brings me down when I read about people like that, and that is entirely what our protagonist is in The Guest. But I think because I only spent in my life like 5 hours with her, and actually the novel is set across only 6 days, it felt quite contained, and I was just really interested by where it was going to go. Now that's sort of where I sort of come to a point with this novel, is that I think what the novel sets up as the premise is more interesting than where we end up. The premise is we're following this woman who I think is around 25. She is spending the summer on Long Island with her much older and very wealthy boyfriend, and she is hoping that things are going to progress with him to the point where she's landed on her feet and she can be with this man who she's not in love with, that is going to pay for her to have this really nice life. And very early on in the novel he basically says, I'm sort of done with you, off you go, and he just pays for a ticket to leave Long Island. And she only has a few $100s in the bank, and she has some baggage left behind in New York that means she doesn't want to go there because she's a bit scared, which I won't spoil but is revealed throughout the novel. And so she decides to just hang around Long Island in the hope that this guy will change his mind in a few days and take her back. So she just has a small bag with I think maybe one change of clothes in it, and it's just about, you just follow her for these 5 or 6 days as she sort of uses people in order to find somewhere to sleep and find something to eat and make contacts with people. And so she's not likeable, and what's quite interesting about this narrative is it's very clear. I don't really want to spoil anything, even though some of the elements of this novel are very clear. But I think I enjoyed it because I sort of went in knowing nothing, so I'm not going to give some things away. But what I will say is some elements of her past to me were very clear from the first few pages, and also I think what she was running from in New York, there's a couple of things that could be, and like it was the obvious ones, which I think was a bit of a disappointment. Like it could have been a bit more interesting than it was. And so what is then interesting about what Emma Cline does is she gives you this woman who's made these life choices, which a lot of people would think, God, I wouldn't want to live that life. And clearly by the way she's ended up, it hasn't ended well. But what a lot of readers would expect is you to be given the reasons why the protagonist had been led to that life. She keeps telling you she hasn't really got anyone she can reach back to family-wise, but you're never told why. So there's a lot of mystery to this character, and it almost feels like she's only really been born from the moment she arrived in New York as like a 19 or 20-year-old, right? So like her past doesn't exist, and that's quite interesting to read about a character who seems to have no past. And she really does use people, you know, there's a few points throughout the novel where she is interacting with people on Long Island, usually quite wealthy people, so there's a degree of you sort of not sympathising with them because of how much wealth they have and how little she does. But there's a point where she like is interacting with a child and you're thinking, God, what's going to happen to this child? And you sort of, you know, so it's very interesting in that regard. But what I found is that it's building up to this time point that, again, I won't spoil, but you know from quite early on what that time point will be. And then when it gets there, I was just really confused. And so I would love to talk to a few people who have read this book. I think this would be a really interesting book club book, because what I can't figure out is like there's maybe two ways. So the ending becomes really unclear, I think. But there's like little tiny bits of writing that I think could be they could be nothing, or they could be like quite big clues to what's actually happening. And I just don't know. I don't know if I'm smart enough to figure out like what Emma Cline was trying to say. This is getting quite low reviews on Goodreads, mainly because people are like, what the fuck was that ending? Like, what did it even mean? And it was really sudden. But yeah, I think within those final 6 pages, there maybe are some clues dropped. And I'm just not sure I entirely, like, it feels almost dreamlike, those final 6 pages. And so it feels like you've had the ending ripped from you because you're not really sure what happened, because it was just all a bit surreal. So yeah, like, even though I ended up not really loving this book, I'm still quite glad I read it. It was a nice experience to read it in the one sitting, and I think it's pretty interesting. So yeah, I would be intrigued to know your thoughts if you read this. And this does really feel like a summer novel. It's very readable. It's very much focused on the he. And what I will say is, in comparison to my memory of the girls, she really does feel like a writerly writer. On the sentence by sentence level, quite a lot of her sentences are quite short, which isn't something I usually enjoy in writing. But there's points when she says things that are just very precise. Her writing has a real precision to it. There's not much extra stuff that doesn't need to be there. And she makes a few comments on like the human condition that I think are really interesting viewpoints, and she puts them on the page really well. So yeah, this was a really interesting one. The next one I'm going to talk about is Looking Glass Down by Katrina Ward. Another one I'm going to have to talk about quite carefully. This book is really weird, right? Because the blurb spoils half the book. And I don't really want to do that, because I think this could be even more interesting if you went in not knowing like where this was going to go at all. So, context for this is, Katrina Ward has quite a few books out, but 2 books ago she moved publisher and she released The Last House on Needless Street. And my understanding is that The Last House on Needless Street, Sundial, and now Looking Glass Sound are with this different publisher because it's sort of a different vibe to her first few books, which I think are all sort of historical gothic horror. These are all contemporary and they are all horror, but in some way the horror elements are all linked to discussions of like mental health, I guess, and trauma. Trauma is a really big part of these most recent 3 novels. The Last House on Needless Street, I thought was such an experience reading it. I thought the horror elements, like I got goosebumps at some points. I wasn't sure about the twist, which I won't spoil, but I've heard a lot of own voices reviewers say they felt it was well handled, so I can't really comment on that. Sundial I really didn't like. I found it an absolute mess. There was way too many elements, and I also felt that like the way the novel wrapped up, I think, was effectively the author saying, if you've suffered really horrible things as a child, you're probably going to be someone who is more capable of violence, which I don't think is a good thing to put out there in the world, right? So I picked this one up with a bit of trepidation, but I was intrigued by it. And there's not much I can say about the plot. This is set in Maine, I think, in a coastal village, and it opens with a teenage boy, his parents taking him to this family summer home just before they sell it, and he makes friends with two other teenagers who live there, a guy and a girl, and the friendship is quite weird because they're very sort of deep, quite dark characters for teenagers, and they tell lots of horror stories and they do lots of quite cruel pranks on one another. And one of the stories they tell, you find out very quickly, is a true story, and that is that there is somebody in the area who breaks into houses at night. He or she takes photos of children with a knife held to their throat while they sleep, and then he leaves the photos behind for the family to see. He doesn't do anything to the children or to the house, but he instills this fear in the community that he can get into any building, and if he wants to, he can kill your children, right? And then another sort of folklore about the area is a woman went missing many years ago, about 10 years ago, swimming, and there's been this sort of folklore about her. That's as much as I'm really going to tell you, I think, even though so much more happens. There's so much more that happens. What I will say is, this novel is incredibly meta. There is a lot of different sort of narratives throughout the novel at different time periods, and the novel ultimately is a commentary on who owns a story. If a community go through a sort of traumatic event that affects many people, is there any one person or any couple of people who have the right to that story being told more than others? And what makes you close to a story like that with a lot of trauma? Is it by being like related to somebody who got hurt, or is it being somebody who was there when it happened? And so that's pretty much what the novel's about. I have really conflicted feelings on this because first chunk, which is the bit I initially described, does read a bit YA, but it is incredibly atmospheric. She does write sentences that do really give you goosebumps, and actually there is some reveals in that first section which I wasn't expecting in terms of quite how horrible they are, and I was even a bit like, I'm not really a fan of reading stuff like this. Like, had I have known, I maybe wouldn't have picked this up, right? So like, just to preface that there's some quite horrible stuff that happens in this. So yeah, in terms of like horror and crime and stuff, which I don't want to say what they are because it's sort of a spoiler. So yeah, it's quite horrible. She's very, her writing's very atmospheric. I think she's incredibly good at describing a location. So these buildings and these landscapes I can really picture. My issues become all the meta stuff gets a bit out of hand by the end, to the point where like maybe the last like 80 pages, maybe even more than that, I just think shouldn't be there at all. And like there was already enough. There was already enough going on. There was already so many. You'd got to a point in the novel where like it was layer after layer being unpicked, and every time you'd be like, what? Like I need to fill it back and like figure that out and like figure out who that was. And then there was another like 80 pages where it just did it even more. And it was just too, like, it just felt too much. I also like, and you're only really gonna get this if you've read the book. I didn't really enjoy Harper's storyline, and I didn't really enjoy any elements of sort of like witchiness that she brought to the novel. I felt again that there was more than enough going on without that being part of it. So I think the conclusion I've come to is that I'm not going to pick up any more novels by this author, because I think the last two have both just felt quite messy. I think she gets a bit carried away with fitting in as much bizarreness as she can, and actually when you strip it back to the core of what she's delivered, it's strong enough without all the extra. Then a book I won't really talk about at all, but if you are a patron of mine and you haven't seen the video where I talk about this yet, then that has been uploaded, and that is Olga Dies Dreaming. This was our, God, I'm losing track of months, May book club pick, and I had really mixed feelings about this one. Like when I originally started reading it, I felt like it was super readable, and I was really interested in like the family dynamics, and a lot of the scenes with the family were really interesting. But then by the time I got like 150 pages in, I had quite a few issues ultimately with this, and I felt like the author really tried to simplify some of the political discussions to the point where like the conversations didn't feel natural between these people who would actually understand all this political context and wouldn't need to discuss it in such a simplified way. So yeah, this was a real mixed bag for me. And then I read Messy Roots, graphic memoir of a Wuhanese American by Laura Gao. As it says, this is a graphic memoir. I really enjoy reading graphic memoirs, and I have read quite a few of them now, and I saw that my library had a copy of this, so I picked it up. This was quite an enjoyable graphic memoirs. I think I've read quite a few that are a lot stronger than this one. And the premise of this is that Laura moved over to the US when I think she was very young, like 3 to 5, because she was being raised in Wuhan by her grandparents, and her parents had already emigrated to the US and then had her sent over. And it's about her growing up and what it was like for her to be a Chinese American, and what it was like to go back and visit her family, and sort of the loss of not staying in China that she felt. And then when she gets to be a teenager, this is where I think it gets a bit confused, because I think what happens is she tries to fit too much into this memoir. There are discussions, very brief discussions, about her discovering her queer identity at college. So that's sort of mentioned, but not really delved in too much. This also covers the whole pandemic. Of course, like I said, her family are from Wuhan, so there was quite a lot of prejudice against them at the time, and that was something she sort of feared saying, that she was from Wuhan, and they had lots of fears for their family, clearly back in Wuhan. Again, that's touched on. It's like in the title, a Wuhanese American, but it's not really delved into. There's a really big discussion throughout about her and her father's relationship, which doesn't really, so I feel like maybe this either needed to be a lot longer or needed to be a couple of different memoirs, where like one of them she dealt with her like coming of age and finding her queer identity, and one of them be about like the whole pandemic experience and what it was like being somebody from Wuhan, because I just felt this was too short, and these things were like touched on, and it was like, oh, that's really interesting, like I'd like to hear more, and then we just didn't really hear more. I think the art style's really nice. I really like the way this is presented. It's very colourful. I just wanted more out of it, basically. Lastly for today, I'm going to talk about Fox Ash by Kate Worsley. I have another couple of books, but it's so hot in here, I just want to finish this video. So I hadn't heard of this book. It's a new release, but I saw that my library had it, and I was immediately pulled in by the title and the cover. This book is set in East Anglia, which is where I'm from, during the interwar years, and it is about a government scheme which I hadn't heard of, which is where families, mainly I think from northern counties who were really impoverished and were struggling, were offered a plot of land in really rural areas like East Anglia, and they were given a home to live in, and they had to basically take out a loan to buy the tools and the seeds and crops they'd need, and then they'd be trained and basically become farmers, and everything they made would then be a profit. We are following a young married couple who I think maybe were from like somewhere near Durham, although I can't remember now. And in the opening chapter, the wife is arriving in East Anglia. Her husband has gone ahead of her for a few months, and it's the first time she's even been on a train, and she arrives at this little cottage, and you immediately know that her and her husband are running from something he did in their town, and they want to make sure no one in East Anglia knows about it. When she gets there, her husband seems a bit too friendly with this older married couple who live in the cottage next door. And also, our protagonist was thinking they were going to have this lovely cottage all to themselves in the middle of nowhere, but actually it's these tiny little detached cottages and they can hear everything the neighbours say through the wall. And the rest of the novel is set only on the land of this farm, which isn't that big, right? So you're only ever in the house, like one of the cottages, or in the land, and it's very oppressive, very claustrophobic, which is intentional because that is, of course, how this young woman feels. Quite early on in the novel, the neighbour starts to give her this medicinal drink because of how sort of unhealthy she's got, because of how poor they were. They had like a really poor diet, and so she says, "Oh, this will get you feeling better." And it's really weird because I don't know if this is just this author's writing style or specifically for this novel, because I immediately was like, that medicine has got to be some sort of drug, because very quickly our protagonist becomes obsessed, like absolutely obsessed with lettuces. Like she has to eat a lettuce every day. It's odd, right? So stuff happens, and from very early on, maybe page 50, I had a pretty big guess about where this novel was going to go. And then the novel carries on and carries on and carries on. And eventually, what I thought was going to happen is revealed like 40 pages from the end of a nearly 400-page book. And then there's like a little extra twist that I hadn't guessed. But I just felt like it didn't warrant all those pages in between. You either need to not let me guess so early and then hold off this reveal, this big reveal, which isn't a big reveal because it's quite easy to guess, or you need to reveal it earlier and have more of an aftermath, because there isn't much, it just sort of ends. So I felt quite mixed feelings, and I also felt like this isn't a very, in the description it's like says it's a gothic novel. It's not gothic, it's certainly unsettling, and the neighbours talk a lot about the changes of the seasons, and they follow certain traditions to do with farming that a lot of people would view as sort of like folklore. But I don't think that makes the novel feel gothic at all. And so yeah, I just ended up feeling a little bit like this was sort of a middle of the road, overly long historical fiction. So I wouldn't recommend it, but also if it's a book you're really interested in, I also wouldn't be like, oh, don't read it, because I ended up just feeling a bit like about it. So yeah, that is everything I'm going to talk about today. I would love to know if you have read any of these and what your thoughts were on them. Like I said, especially The Guest, which I keep wanting to call The Girls. But yeah, I would especially like to know your thoughts on that. And in fact, I was going to say The Last House on Needless Street, God, Looking-Glass Sound, because I think both of them are quite interesting plot-wise, and I would be intrigued to know what other people thought about them. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.